Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Little Rock, where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. And now I invite our illuminator, Ann Perry, to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which is printed in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
For some time, I have felt that there is a certain energy in my feelings over the past year and a half or so about our adventures resisting the attempts by our federal government's executive branch and its enablers in the other two branches to implement the Heritage Foundation's program, Project 2025. There are plenty of good reasons and motivations for resistance, but there has been a certain something in the mix for me this year that I hadn't quite put my finger on until this month. Last April marked my third full year as an Arkansan, which I know is a significant milestone. My mother always used to say, it takes you 3 years to start to feel at home in a new place, and that's when the company moves you. I'm grateful for y'all's patience with me as I have transitioned from being a fully naturalized New Orleanian to becoming an Arkansan. Mother was right. I do feel at home in Little Rock now. And I have some distance from New Orleans now. And I think that's why the aha came this month. Each year, as August 29th approaches, I think of the effects Hurricane Katrina had on my former congregation, full of people I grew to love and appreciate over my decade of serving them. The first thing I noticed within a month, my starting date there was August 1st, was what was happening every year on August 29th. On that day in 2013, our building and grounds chair, Mary Jo Day, I just learned week before last that Mary Jo passed away this past June at the age of 86. She moved away from New Orleans maybe a year or so before I left. Mary Jo had set up an appointment with an electrician, I think it was, to do some work in the sanctuary. This being my first month on the job, I thought I ought to join them so I could find out a little about the sanctuary's problems, many of which stemmed from the fact that after the storm it had stood in 5 feet of water for about 4 weeks. As Mary Jo and the electrician talked and I listened, there came a moment when the conversation stopped. I didn't perceive what prompted the interruption, but for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, they asked each other, "Where were you? Where did you go? Who did you lose?" And then just as abruptly, they returned to discussing whatever it was that was wrong with the power in the sanctuary. I witness moments like that annually on August 29th, gradually fewer of them each year, until the pandemic gave us all a new trauma to think about. I think, though, that the pandemic trauma did not dissipate Katrina trauma, it just displaced it from public discourse a bit. In 2015, 2 years into my ministry there, the city held public ceremonies on the 10th anniversary of the storm. Most of my people weren't interested. Some left town that weekend to avoid having to hear another official story of the storm. They had their own stories. They knew what happened. They didn't need to hear the new crew of politicians tell new lies about it or use the occasion to further their political agendas. The biggest political effect Katrina had was to reveal unmistakably the systems of oppression that had operated in New Orleans for decades, if not centuries. The city celebrated its 300th anniversary of its founding in 2018. In brief, neighborhoods of wealth and privilege in the city recovered and were rebuilt relatively quickly. Those less advantageously placed, geographically and financially, but also socially, politically, racially, and in other ways, we're still recovering 10 years later. And large areas of the city were still in ruins 10 years later. The sheer scale of the disaster contributed to the length of the recovery, and there was an element of improvisation in the rebuilding. The sanctuary, where we were still resolving electrical issues 8 years after the storm, had new wainscoting up where the floodwaters had risen. It had not had wainscoting before, but after Katrina, you couldn't find a plasterer. There was so much demand for them. And we'd had a wood floor stage in the gymnasium. It was a huge building that had to be demolished. The wood then was salvaged to make the wainscoting. There was also creativity. Tile companies came to town and donated inventories of tile toward rebuilding the city. That sanctuary also had a tile floor with an inlaid labyrinth designed and mostly built by one member of the church. But Tracy Washington's passing reference in the reading to the Road Home program evokes for the knowing a labyrinth of legal and bureaucratic obstacles placed in the way of families who had evacuated and now had no home and maybe no job to come back to, were struggling to make ends meet, even as they struggled with who they lost, even if they even knew who they lost, and how they could rebuild on their property if they could even prove it was theirs, since so many records, personal and official, had been washed away. Some lost their homes because large public housing developments were demolished and less dense housing built to replace it. They knew who had lived there, those developers and the officials who cleared the way for them. They knew whose road home they were blocking, at least as a demographic. For more than a decade after the storm, stories about all that were among those shared in those moments when conversation stopped on August 29th. It was a sort of spontaneous annual ritual, randomly performed across all neighborhoods and demographics of the city. It arose from the depths of hundreds of thousands of New Orleanians' traumatized souls. It was among many expressions of resilience And the pain of it caused many to react to awestruck praise for how resilient they were, with anger, if not contempt, for the ignorance of such praise. More than once I heard someone say, "I'm so tired of being called resilient." Unspoken in that was the added pain of not being seen and understood in their struggle. "Have you no care, no interest in what I'm going through?" they might have asked. To praise me thus suggests you just don't want to know. For those used to navigating systemic racism and like oppressions, it was nothing new that nobody wanted to know. But I'll tell you what, some folks channeled that into organizing. And because Katrina leveled not only physical structures of neighborhoods, but also the structures of parochialism that divided them, many organizers who had not worked together before now, united by calamity, formed partnerships. Social separations ignored during Mardi Gras, dissolved at fairgrounds during Jazz Fest, and suspended in the Superdome for the Saints, now were bridged by durable relationships. What had held neighborhoods together began to build new linkages across the city. Now I need to pause briefly to explore, how did I minister to folks healing from Katrina trauma? How did those experiences shape me? What did I learn? First, I listened a lot. "How can 5 years seem like a lifetime?" Tracy Washington asked. "And how can it be that so much of what has happened to individuals and to our community has been lost as though stripped from our collective memory?" I knew instinctively that listening to folks' stories was important, and I gradually came to understand that many of the people, of my people, were no further along in putting the pieces together than I was. For different reasons, of course. They had been overwhelmed. I had been absent. And so we could be partners in that effort. I had the emotional distance from the events to ask some good questions on lucky days. And they had memories, fragments at least, that they could sort through and test against the question and others' stories. Also, it was healing for many, and it was orienting and educational for me to get involved in local organizing aimed at addressing needs, redressing wrongs, and uncovering truth. Those were the two most prominent modes of my ministry there: listening and getting involved. One way that those experiences shaped me was that I absorbed, unawares, a somewhat higher baseline level of stress that comes with living in a hurricane zone. Early on, the most seasoned and least anxious leaders in the church quietly advised me to assemble an evacuation kit: important papers, medicines, things I needed to care for my cats, and certain things one wouldn't think of having ready but for some experience of evacuating. It is a high-stakes version of collecting camping equipment. I did that at a beginner's level. Fortunately, I never had to evacuate. But there were other things I learned to prepare for sheltering in place and surviving if power or water services were interrupted, as happened with Hurricane Ida. And then there was the sensitivity I gradually acquired to hurricane forecasts. They are to be taken in moderation, like whiskey, only for medicinal purposes. I didn't realize that I had that higher baseline of anxiety until I moved here, out of the zone. Yes, we have thunderstorms like we did last night, and we have tornadoes. But I grew up in the Midwest, and besides, there's really no comparison. I liken it to when I worked in a bank data center years ago, and I finally got off the night shift and started to work days. I had had no idea how much of my precious life energy was getting burned up in keeping my schedule upside down, sleeping during the day so that I could work at night, until I quit having to do it. What I learned by getting small, vicarious or direct tastes of it was something of what healing from trauma, serious trauma on the order of Katrina, must feel like, and how complex it is to navigate. And subsequently, I've studied more about it. The image on the cover of your order of service shows some basic things about trauma that science has learned. When triggered by something that evokes a past trauma in the mind, rational thought goes weak, emotional reaction can be intense, interpersonal interactions can get prickly, and baseline anxiety can rise. And all that can be going on, and all you really know in the moment is that you're feeling a bit anxious or fearful or vigilant or worried, or it might even be something stronger, a sense of dread, perhaps. It need not be a conscious memory of past trauma, even one you know about and could describe an experience that was emotionally traumatic, or one of stress or sensory overwhelm or a high-pressure conflict, any of those things. And it just sort of sneaks up and surprises you and others as one of those feelings in the moment, and you find it harder to think clearly, to stay calm, to be patient, to feel heard. Now, back to our adventures in resistance to Project 2025. The highly charged atmosphere of partisan division and conflict that we are enduring from this perspective might be interpreted as a complex gumbo of variously aligning trauma responses. Whatever else it is, the democracy undermining recommendations of Project 2025 now being tested out at the federal level are fear-driven policies with neighbor-harming effects. They produce abusive patterns in our systems and institutions. Living under such policies and patterns of force is like monitoring weather in the Atlantic during hurricane season. You really want as little to do with it as possible, but you have to pay attention to it. You have to be prepared. This state of mind is a common symptom in unprocessed trauma, not the sort of thing you want to institutionalize into democracy if you want to keep it. A week ago, last Friday, Public Radio's On the Media program re-aired the first part of a 4-part series they produced last May titled American Emergency. It described the history of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, which was created in 1979 by President Carter to handle emergency management and civil defense. FEMA quickly became the rope in a tug of war between anxious advocates for emergency preparedness and fearful champions of national security. Early on, that tug of war got started because the Reagan administration was bent on implementing a policy manifesto called Mandate for Leadership, which, like Project 2025, was produced by the Heritage Foundation. Yes, we have been here before. The difference is the climate has changed. Later, the national traumas of 9/11 and Katrina would complicate matters at FEMA. It strikes me as a study in fear-driven government worth listening to. It seems to me that a complex gumbo of variously aligning trauma responses is not the basis of good government. Routine tactics of inducing stress, overwhelm, high-pressure conflict, and emotional trauma are not going to get us where any of us want to be. Current political efforts to push the bullies and con men and power mongers out of positions of authority and leadership is a step in the right direction. As important, I think, for many of us and our neighbors will be to sift through the damage that has been done, to rebuild, and to make the shift from asking questions like, where were you? Where did you go? Who did you lose? To asking questions like, how did I contribute? How has it changed me? And what did I learn? May we repair and rebuild. May we ask good questions. May we find good answers on common ground. Amen.
I invite you to remain standing as I invite Ann back up to extinguish our chalice. And we join together in saying our closing words. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. And honor all beings.
And may we ask the questions that heal.